There was broadly the after-apartheid consensus about South Africa and a specific status for South Africa within the American foreign policy was maintained for close to 30 years. And that was that South Africa was a strategic partner to the US in Africa. The fact that South Africa had close ties with certain countries like China were usually looked away from by American leaders. That America didn't focus that much on South African domestic policy, things that happened in South Africa. I think that completely changed this year with President Trump back in the White House. Trump now completely destroyed that old consensus, American diplomatic consensus on South Africa, and a complete new policy is developing.
You are welcome to today's episode of the Beyond Africa podcast with me, Ngalim Bernard, and we continue a deep dive into South Africa and the complex dynamic relationship between South Africa and the United States of America. And today we focus on the recent Oval Office meeting between President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa and President Donald Trump of the United States. Joining us for this edition is Jaco Kleynhans, who has been here before. If you remember very well, he's the head of international liaison for the Solidarity Movement and a leading voice on Afrikaner rights, trade union relations, and South Africa's global positioning. With his sharp insights from the Solidarity Movement and his podcast, Jaco will unpack the diplomatic fallout, trade implications, and what this high-stakes meeting means for Afrikaner advocacy and South Africa's future in the world stage. You are welcome back to the Beyond Africa podcast, Jaco Kleynhans.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a privilege.
Yeah, you came, you went away, and you continued your advocacy. And we saw this meeting at the White House. How did you feel when you heard that President Trump had invited President Cyril Ramaphosa to discuss South African issues in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, I think it just made sense, There was such a strong focus the last 3.5 months from the Trump administration on South Africa, So somewhere there had to be a discussion between the leaders of the two countries. I think President Trump set a very strong agenda over the last 3 months for such a meeting. And he specifically put certain issues on the table that he wanted to be discussed. So I think the reason that President Trump invited President Ramaphosa was to discuss these specific issues, but then also to indicate that he's still serious about South Africa. I think that's the positive thing. The American government still want to engage with South Africa. They still view South Africa as an important partner, and that creates great opportunities, for some kind of settlement between the two countries.
What did you note as the main difference between the visit with President Trump and the visit with President Biden?
Yes, yeah, quite a big difference, I think what we've seen in the past, that's not only with President Biden, it was before him, President Obama, and before him, President George Bush, and even Bill Clinton before that, was that there was usually a status quo maintained in terms of American foreign policy towards South Africa. There was broadly the after-apartheid consensus about South Africa and a specific status for South Africa within the American foreign policy was maintained for close to 30 years. And that was that South Africa was a strategic partner to the US in Africa, that the fact that South Africa had close ties with certain countries like China were usually looked away from by American leaders. And that America didn't focus that much on South African domestic policy, things that happened in South Africa. I think that completely changed this year with President Trump back in the White House. Trump now completely destroyed that old consensus, American diplomatic consensus on South Africa, and a complete new policy is developing in the White House, in the State Department, in the American Congress on how to deal with South Africa, but I think many other countries also. So there may be a lot of risks included in that, but there's also great opportunity. So yes, it's a complete departure from how President Biden met with President Ramaphosa, and the usual things were said. Nothing new really. The same kinds of confirmations of relations and so on were confirmed. While this time around, yeah, it was something that we've never seen before. Let's be honest, it was the kind of meeting that never ever happened before, I think, in the White House.
You seem to be saying that there is a complete change of policy now from the apartheid South Africa to an independent democratic South Africa, and the United States seems to be recognizing that. The United States wants to pull South Africa out of Chinese, Iranian, and Russian influence. I didn't hear him mention any of this yesterday. So why are you thinking towards that direction?
Yes, I think that's interesting that yesterday's discussion, the one in front of the cameras, the media, was basically only focused on South African domestic policy. It was a focus on things like farmer tax and farm murders and the Expropriation Act, which allow for land expropriation without any compensation. Then there is the issue of minority rights that were discussed. And yes, there was efforts from the South African delegation to refocus on trade and economic relations, investments by America in the South African economy. But let's be honest, that was just one part of this whole meeting. What happened in front of the cameras, the hour that we saw. There's also information that many of the more foreign policy issues were discussed afterwards. It was also discussed the day before when certain committees of the delegations met with each other. There were also from the South African delegation side meetings with members of Congress. That was also discussed there, specifically by Congress members on the Foreign Relations Committee. So I think the whole issue of South Africa's foreign relations was not completely left out during this 2 or 3 day trip by President Ramaphosa and his colleagues to Washington. But yes, very interestingly enough, the whole focus, I think by coincidence, during this very public meeting in front of the cameras, was then largely on issues like the farmer tax in South Africa.
Yeah, you've touched a couple of issues there, and I just want the viewers to realize that you understand this very deeply because you are one of those South Africans who has been involved in the advocacy touching the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress and other think tanks in the United States to raise awareness on what is happening in South Africa. So your understanding of the issues is not superficial; it's very well informed, and you equally have networks within DC. So from your networks and contacts, what are you hearing as the concessions from either sides so far?
Yes. So what I've heard from my network within Washington, these are both my contacts in the White House, State Department, and Congress, is that there's a willingness from the Trump administration to make some kind of deal with South Africa. So it's not a case of the Trump administration wanting to isolate South Africa like they've done with Iran or Venezuela. There's not a need to cut South Africa completely off from access to the American market. There's a real willingness to come to some kind of agreement with the South African government. But there was also yesterday, and that was afterwards, that was in the closed meeting, a very clear demand from the Americans on specific things like the Black Economic Empowerment legislation, which they said makes it difficult for American companies to do business in South Africa. There were specific demands on property rights. The Americans demanded from South Africa to give better assurances of how they will ensure property rights in South Africa. And there were then, in return for that, a willingness for greater investments from the American side to South Africa, even some humanitarian aid to South Africa, and then also great access to the American market. And that's really important for South Africa. We're an export-driven country. For our economy, exports are extremely important. We have a really poor population. We don't sustain our economy by consumer spending, but rather by trade. So trade is important, and while we are trying to expand our trade in places like Asia and the Middle East and Africa, trade with America is very important. About 10% of our exports go to America. We believe that can still expand. There's great opportunities to export more agricultural products to America, even more mining projects. And the Americans are willing. They want to buy things like minerals from South Africa. So we believe that the Americans are willing to offer good trade agreements to South Africa in turn for certain political concessions.
Thank you. That is quite deep regarding the economic demands. This sounds to me like demands that the United States made. Did they make any concessions?
Yes, I think the concessions that the Americans made is specifically on things like duties, like the import duties. Remember, there's currently this fear that within the next few weeks we can have a 40% import duty on South African products that we export to America. That is actually what President Trump initially announced. Then there was the postponement of 90 days. So I think the Americans are very much willing to look at lowering those duties to as low as 10%, even further expand access to the American market for South African products. They are willing to make greater capital investments in South Africa, and the American government are willing to get involved again with certain projects in South Africa. What that will be, that I don't know. It may be humanitarian, it may be certain development projects that we don't know. We will have to find out about that. But I mean, there's a willingness to from the American side to really engage with South Africa. There's also a willingness for President Trump to review his decision not to attend the G20 summit. I think that's something that's for South Africa very important. You've heard President Ramaphosa also emphasizing that he really wants President Trump to attend the G20 summit in November in South Africa. And I think what was clear is that President Trump is now really considering that. He's really taking that serious. I think that's good. I think that's a good thing. I think it can be a great opportunity for South Africa, the G20 summit. And if there's a big controversy around the G20 summit with Trump being absent and all of that, I think that can have a negative effect on our image as a country.
Yeah, thank you so much. One thing you have not touched on is the AGOA. And last time you were on this platform, you spoke elaborately about the AGOA. And one of your objectives of going to DC at the time was to advocate for the US not to terminate AGOA. What is the state of AGOA right now?
Yes, there's still great uncertainty. I've spoken to members of Congress last week. They are skeptical that there's a chance that AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, will be renewed. So maybe by September, things can change, but it's quite possible that we will see that the AGOA Act will just lapse in September. It will not be renewed. And that means that the 32 African countries that currently benefit from AGOA will each need to negotiate a separate trade agreement with America. And that is what South Africa now need to do. So I'm personally also skeptical if AGOA will survive till next year. It looks like the Trump administration rather preferred this direct bilateral agreements, and we see quite a number of movements from African countries. Even our neighboring countries like Zimbabwe and Botswana, they are very far with negotiations with the Americans on trade agreements. Even Lesotho, which is a very small country, Zambia are in negotiations with the American government. And South Africa will need to do the same. We can't sit and wait in the hope that AGOA will be renewed. I'm very skeptical at the moment because there's no movement from the White House advocate for AGOA to be renewed. And in the American Congress, Republicans are not taking any further steps to work on a new AGOA Act. And as you know, the Republicans currently control the Senate and the House of Representatives. So I think there's a policy shift currently in Washington, D.C., and that is to negotiate separate trade agreements with all African countries.
Yeah, I don't know if you know Sandile Swana. I spoke to him recently, and he told me that he would prefer trade between the United States and South Africa goes back to where it was before the AGOA, because the AGOA covers only a very limited amount of trade. And I think other people have argued also that AGOA may not be very good for trade because it has conditionalities like human rights conditions attached to it. Are you still so attached to AGOA, or you are looking at AGOA just as another added advantage that South Africa can benefit from?
Yes, I think it's an added advantage. I think what is important is that South Africa benefited quite a lot from AGOA, much more than any other African country, simply because certain industries adapted quickly, the car manufacturing industry, the agricultural industry, and they benefited quite a lot. You know, since AGOA was enacted in 2000, so over the last 25 years, our exports to America more than doubled. You know, so we had a very high increase, close to 300% increase actually in exports to America. But I mean, that can very easily be replaced by a good trade agreement. And you're right, you know, I think the Trump administration like that. They don't like these broad agreements that cover many different countries, and every year you need to renew it. It creates a lot of uncertainty. We've seen the effect that it had on certain African economies. Ethiopia were quite influenced by the decision 2 years ago by the Biden administration to kick them out of AGOA, you know. So I think Trump wants longer term trade agreements that will create more stable trading environments, and that makes sense. I think that really makes sense, but I think we also have a limited time left to really negotiate a good agreement. So there's a lot of work that now needs to happen. I think we must be very honest about that. This meeting, this visit to Washington is just a short public event. The real work will need to happen over the next few days and weeks.
Are you hoping that something positive is going to happen?
Yes, I absolutely hope so. And I believe it is possible. I think President Ramaphosa cannot look back anymore. He now needs to take certain steps that is possible. I think it is necessary for President Ramaphosa to show political leadership. I mean, he's been elected many times as South Africa's president, and South Africans demand of him to take certain steps. I think it's quite easy to act on things like farm murders. It's easy to act on things like property rights. There's very specific things that he can announce to move this whole process forward. And I think if he just proposed 3 or 4 very simple policy changes in South Africa in terms of things like BEE, in terms of the Expropriation Act, and then specifically farm murders, creating a specialist unit to look into the reasons for farm murders, then it's quite possible that the Americans can be satisfied by that and that a trade agreement can very easily be reached. So I'm still very hopeful, but I mean, yes, there's certainly great risks if that doesn't happen.
Yeah, this would sound like concessions that he might have made in DC. Did you hear about any concessions from the South African side?
Yes, I think there was clearly a willingness to act on things like the farm murders. So what I've heard was that the South African delegation discussed the possibility that they will declare farm murders a priority crime, and that there will then be a specialist unit created to investigate farm murders. So if that happens, I think that's a very, very positive step. There will be some reaction, and I think that what I've heard is that Ramaphosa are willing to look at ways to ensure some level of promises, at least, about expropriation. The Expropriation Act are creating the opening for expropriation with zero compensation. And I think what Ramaphosa are trying to say to the Americans, and I think you need to say that more publicly, is that agricultural land that's in use, that's currently farmed on, will not be expropriated, with zero compensation, or even with lower than market value compensation, because it will have a very negative effect on South African food production. So I think there was a willingness to look at that, but the political processes in South Africa, and that's the challenge. You always have these internal processes within the African National Congress, the governing party in South Africa. I think that's been always one of the challenges of President Ramaphosa. He doesn't like to take decisions on his own. He always wants to go back to the party, try and get a mandate. And the problem is that the ANC are very much divided internally. There's a lot of division in the party. There's different groups working against each other, and that can create a challenge if the difficult political decisions need to be made on a party political level and not on a government level. I think it's really time now for President Ramaphosa to use his political capital, his position as president, and to just make certain important and difficult positions on simple issues, like property rights, like farm attacks, farm safety, minority rights, and racial laws, that can really be addressed, I think, quite easily.
Yeah, I wanted to point out something about the Expropriation Act and the nil compensation. I think the act says that land that is not being developed or being used, that is just laying there since the owner acquired it, can be expropriated at nil, not farm or agricultural land.
Yes, but there's one problem. There's an article in the Act that lists 3 or 4 reasons why and when property, and that's any property, can be expropriated with nil, with zero compensation. But then there's one line, and that is our big issue with the Act. There's one line that says that these are not exclusive to these 4 above mentioned reasons, and when the government, or when it is believed to be in the public interest, then there can also be other reasons, and that is what is worrying to us. I hear what the current president is saying. I don't think President Ramaphosa will make a decision to expropriate good farmland with nil compensation. Also, not the current ministers in the cabinet. My fear is what will happen with the next government, maybe in 3 or 4 or 5 years. May they believe that it is in the public interest to expropriate farmland at nil compensation. And that is my big problem, is this whole issue of public interest. Who determines public interest? And the Act is not very clear on that. Maybe it's the courts, maybe it's Parliament, maybe it's elected politicians. That's not very clear. And that is the single most important thing that we are concerned about.
Okay, I hear you. And talking about making that a concession to review that law, AfriForum announced today that they are beginning their constitutional challenge of that law in court. And do you think that the compensation can work effectively in court or the negotiations can work for a concession if the case is in court?
Yes, that's a challenge, I think what is important is this whole legal process was already announced a few months ago, so it's a coincidence that that legal process now started, but I mean, there was a long process to get to this point. It's not only AfriForum, there's also many other organizations that's also in the process to take this Expropriation Act to court. I think, while that will be a very long legal process, I don't think there will be any legal finality on that within a few months. And I hope that can rather still be resolved by political negotiations. That's a much, much better solution than a court case. I think for us as an organization, we will rather prefer a negotiated settlement on dealing with the single point actually in the Expropriation Act, than rather to have a very long and excruciating legal process up to the Constitutional Court.
I hear you. And talking about the farm murders, all newspapers I've read this morning are talking about President Trump ambushing President Cyril Ramaphosa with a false claim of white genocide, but you are calling it farm murders. Why is there a difference in terminology here?
Yes, I think from an American side, and I think from the thinking of President Trump and many people around him, they interpret what is happening in South Africa as an early phase of a genocide. And they look at hate speech like the singing of the song, "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer." They look at the the percentage of farmers killed in farm attacks. Now, to give you an idea, white farmers are making up 0.03% of the South African population. It's 25,000 people in a country of 63 million. And last year, they made up 1% of all murders. So 1% of murders, but 0.03% of the population. So that is serious. It's very, very serious. We as an organization just said we're not getting really involved in debates about how you want to term it. I think there's a different thinking in certain American circles about how they view this as a problem. We specifically view it as a safety problem on South African farms. 30 years ago, we had a system in South Africa called the commando system, where people were organized in every single town to protect farms. People were allowed to wear weapons, and the farming community broadly, and that is people of all backgrounds and all races, were much safer than today. Then the government dismantled that whole system, commando system, but they didn't replace it with anything better. We have serious problems with the police force in South Africa. They are not investigating farm attacks as they should be. They're not patrolling rural areas like they're supposed to do at night. They don't give the necessary infrastructure to safeguard rural areas. So there's also an unwillingness, a very clear unwillingness from the South African government to take this issue serious. Then there's the hate speech that we believe President Ramaphosa was supposed to address many years ago. I mean, he was forced now by President Trump to distance himself from a song like Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer. We are delighted that President Ramaphosa did that. But why was it necessary for an American president to force him to do that? You know, he could have done that many years ago and we could have resolved that issue long ago. So we believe to focus on the whole issue of safety on South African farms. We represent farmers and their families. They are committed to South Africa. They want to make South Africa work. They want to produce food for the 63 million people in South Africa, but they live in fear. They live in very difficult situation. We heard the golfer, the golf player, Retief Goosen last night in the White House telling the story of his own family in Limpopo province, you know, where his mother was attacked in her house, where other farmers were killed, where farms are burned down, where his brothers still farm but need to live in a house surrounded by electrical fencing. That is the story of most South African farmers today. We must safeguard them as we must safeguard any other South Africans.
The safety of all Africans is necessary within the territories where they live, and they need to operate freely and perform their economic activities safely. And governments must ensure that they guarantee this safety for citizens. And that is one of the positions that we take here on the Beyond Africa podcast. So I wanted to ask you, what was your impression when President Trump played the video of Julius Malema singing Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer, and Johan Rupert reacting and putting the white farm murders within the broader context of crime in South Africa?
Yes, I think Johan Rupert was wrong, you know. I think, and I have lots of respect for him. He's someone that we've engaged with also many times, but I don't think he's got all the statistics. I mean, Johan Rupert doesn't spend that much time in South Africa. I don't think he's always so much up to date with crime statistics in South Africa, and he's right that there's a general problem of crime in South Africa, an enormous problem. Last year, more than 26,000 murders, but I don't think he necessarily have all the statistics around farm murders. I think his comment about sleeping with his door open were just a little silly, because where Johan Rupert's house is in South Africa, he has a large number of private security people guarding his house and his whole property. So then you can sleep with your door open if there's a large number of private security people making sure that your door can stay open, you know. So, I mean, I've got lots of respect for him, but he's a billionaire and I think he lives in his own world. And I was rather wishing that he would really address certain economic concerns, you know, in South Africa. What was very clear about the whole issue of the economic freedom fighters and Julius Malema is that there was an effort by President Ramaphosa and even his Minister of Agriculture, John Steenhuisen, to downplay the support of the EFF, to downplay the role of something like the song and of Julius Malema. And I think that's wrong. I mean, there's certain certain municipalities in South Africa, even Johannesburg, where the ANC is governing in coalition with Malema's party, with the EFF. So Ramaphosa's effort to completely distance himself from Malema, I think, is a little disingenuous. And I think the fact that 10% of the South African population voted for Mr. Malema and his party is not so small that you can just ignore it. It is a serious issue, and I think the whole issue around Malema and what he's doing and what he's saying need to be addressed. And I think President Ramaphosa must show leadership and really do something about that issue. I think it's also just creating unnecessary racial tension in South Africa. We can't afford this kind of racial tension. We've always said, as an organization ourselves, that we need to keep racial relations amongst normal South Africans good. You can never deal with relationships between politicians. That will always be their business. But normal South Africans need to work amongst together every single day to make this country work.
Yeah, what do you think President Cyril Ramaphosa can do in this case? This case has been adjudicated right to the Constitutional Council, right to the Constitutional Court, that has said they have the right to sing it simply because it is a remembrance of the days of the struggle.
Yeah, I think the problem is simply people who are appointed as on the Constitutional Court, but I mean that's a complete and a very long discussion for a different time. I'm very concerned about certain decisions made recently by the Constitutional Court, but I think there's practical things that President Ramaphosa can do. I mean, he can more publicly distance himself from the song. President Ramaphosa are still viewed as the most important political leader in South Africa. He's very much respected by many South Africans, and especially Black South Africans, and that is very important that people hear from him on this. I think he must talk more about racial relations in South Africa. I think he must play much more of a role to bring people closer together. We must really have a process in South Africa where politicians tone down their rhetoric. There's been too much hateful rhetoric recently in South Africa during political campaigns from different political parties. And I think President Ramaphosa needs to become more of a statesman and make specific statements about this. I think that's still within his power to do that. I think he can certainly reach out to Mr. Malema. He can discuss this whole issue with him. He can publicly discourage people to sing the song. So yeah, I think outside of the legal process, there are certainly things as a political leader, as the president of the country, that he can still do.
Yeah, so talking again about Mr. Johan Rupert, he made a request for American businesses to come invest in South Africa. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I'm very positive about that. I think it's absolutely necessary. South Africa is, again, also very dependent on foreign direct investment. We've seen a lot of outflow of foreign capital out of South Africa for the last 10 years, especially it started during the Zuma years with the corruption in South Africa. I think there's lots of American companies sitting on big capital. They want to invest it in foreign countries, and they are looking at Africa. They're looking at the African continent. It's the fastest growing continent in terms of population. There's very high economic growth in many African countries, and South Africa is still the best country to do business from to the rest of Africa. So when I engage with American companies and American business forums through the American Embassy in Pretoria, which I do regularly, American companies tell me that they want to invest much, much more in South Africa, but they want less regulations. They want it to be easier to invest. They want specific insurances about things like property rights. I think that's all doable. I really believe that's doable. So I do support this whole focus of Johan Rupert to try and really encourage American businesses to invest. And yes, like I've said, American businesses sit on so much capital. I think, if I'm correct, it's the most capital that they ever had in the history that they're not currently investing in foreign countries because of all the global uncertainty. There's just so much global uncertainty. And I think actually South Africa can benefit from that. I mean, let's be honest. We are very far away from the conflict zones in the world currently, far away from the tension between China and Taiwan and the war in Ukraine and the Middle Eastern problems. South Africa are supposed to be a very, very nice investment country for American companies. So let's hope that they can become something bigger from that.
Yeah, he was very specific that he wants Starlink to come in. Does
Yeah.
that show a sign of him already talking with President Cyril Ramaphosa and the powers that be about granting some concessions regarding the BEE problems that Elon Musk was hesitant about?
Yes, I think that's something that were discussed. Also, my sources indicate that to me. Something that were discussed in the closed meeting later yesterday, and I think that there will be some kind of concession. That is something that Johan Rupert publicly, but also behind for the last few weeks. Actually, I understand that he pushed this with President Ramaphosa, and that it looks like the South African government are willing to make certain concessions there, and in return for that, the Americans are willing to invest money in things like rural internet access and so forth. So I think there's a deal coming on that. That's good. I mean, we still have large rural parts in South Africa, mostly in deep rural areas where people simply don't have good internet access. I think that's a big challenge in the country.
So, within the broader context of South Africa American relations, I know you've spoken about sanctions in the past. Are you still for the fact that the United States should sanction individuals who are causing the strain in the relationship between the two countries?
Yes, I think that's that. I mean, that's always a possibility, you know. That's always something that may happen, and that's something that is currently under investigation by a committee in the American Congress. So it's not something that was just cancelled by yesterday's meeting. I do believe that President Trump, and that is also from my sources in the White House, that President Trump don't want to do that currently. He doesn't want to implement sanctions against certain corrupt South African politicians. And understand, this is people who were directly involved in large-scale corruption. President Trump wants a political settlement. He wants some kind of political solution, and then you don't need to do all these kinds of things. I view that positive. You know, I don't want the relationship to go the same way as Iran, you know, or Venezuela. I mean, that's been devastating to the populations of those countries. At the moment, I think there's not really talk of immediate sanctions. But I mean, if things don't go the right direction, that's still a possibility.
How convinced are you that things are going to change after this meeting?
I'm hopeful, but I'm also cautious. We've had many negotiations with the Ramaphosa government. We had late last year, months of negotiations with President Ramaphosa himself and with his senior staff. We actually came to an agreement, and that was on the BaPf&x Act, which is an education act to protect Afrikaans language schools. We came to an agreement, and then afterwards, President Ramaphosa just went and signed the bill into law. And he actually broke the agreement with us, you know. So that also led to a quite a big and serious breakup in the relationship between Afrikaners in general and the Ramaphosa government. And after that, we had the whole issue of the Expropriation Act. There was broadly many organizations and individuals who told President Ramaphosa that the Expropriation Act is unconstitutional because of those exceptions, that broad exception that they make for nil compensation. And President Ramaphosa, despite all the advice in the world, even from very wealthy business people like Johan Rupert, and from the American government, pressure from the Americans and from several European countries, he went went ahead and signed the Expropriation Act. So I'm always worried that President Ramaphosa will just go ahead. He will just go along and do what certain people in his party want him to do, and that he will not show the necessary leadership to make certain political changes. But I am really hopeful, certainly because the American government are in a position to put lots of pressure on South Africa. We saw that last night. We saw it in the White House. And I think there's a real thinking among certain people now within the ANC and within the South African government that if they do make certain policy changes, that it can have positive economic effects in South Africa that will actually help the ANC in the next election. And I mean, that is what the ANC is always focused on. They're always focused on the next election with current very high levels of unemployment, extremely high poverty rates in South Africa. I think that may just sway the ANC and President Ramaphosa to make certain changes.
Yeah, I should have spoken about the Bella Act, but we are running out of time. But I want us to focus again on something that happens in the United States, and that is the refugee status that has been granted to the Afrikaners. How did you perceive that, especially when the first 49 arrived?
Yeah, I think what is important is that we've never lobbied for that. I just always tell people that's not something that we've asked the Trump administration for. Also, when we were there in February, but we haven't been opposed to that. You know, I mean that's the American government's right. Trump was elected democratically in November last year, and he has the right, if you want to offer that status to certain groups of people. And if you look at the group of Afrikaners who received this refugee status, the first group, many of those people were really persecuted people. They were people who were affected by extreme trauma from farm attacks. Certain people lost their land because of land invasions. And the fact that the police and government didn't assist them with the land invasions. So I do feel sad for them, you know. I don't want to see people leave. That is also bad for our country. We don't want to see people leave and skills especially leaving the country. And I think what we're going to do, and I think that's hopefully part of the future relationship, is to limit further the number of people who will further take up this opportunity. There's at the moment 8,000 applications that the American embassy in Pretoria are looking at. So there may be many more Afrikaners going to America under this scheme. But I hope that we can limit it, that we can still give people hope to rather stay in South Africa, to work here and build on this country and create a better future here.
That sounds a little bit frustrating to have at least 8,000 people wanting to leave the African continent. I don't support that at all. I know I live out of the continent, but my objective and my goal is to go back as soon as possible. And this podcast is one of those avenues through which I would like to contribute to the development of the continent and see the African diaspora actually go back to the continent to build the continent. Recently, you were on a tour in Europe. Do you want to tell us something about that?
Yes, so I was recently in Europe for 3 weeks. I visited 8 countries, and I discussed many of the same issues at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Visited many parliaments, from the Dutch Parliament, Belgian Parliament, Dutch government, and I discussed the way forward with relations with South Africa. We also need more investments from Europe, better trade agreements, also a very strong focus on issues in South Africa. Also, in the run-up to the G20 summit, which is very important. Several European countries are part of the G20. The European Union is part of the G20, and that creates great opportunities to have discussions about South Africa's role in the world, in Africa, and a strong return in South Africa to basic things that we believe are very important. Equal rights, you know, we need to move forward in South Africa. We can't always have this thinking of some people who are losers, some people who are winners, and that we must always try to fix the sins of the past. We must move forward together as a people, as South Africans, to create a better future for the country, and we need as much help as possible from other countries. And I think Europe plays a very, very important role. They're still a big trading partner, big investment partner in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Jaco Kleynhans. Do you have any last words for our viewers?
Yes, I think what is important is that South Africa is still a very important country in Africa, and South Africa, I wish to see that South Africa can play a greater role in the future development of Africa. That's something that many people hoped for and wished for 30 years ago. I think South Africa failed to a certain extent in that, and that is sad. In Southern Africa, for example, South Africa had to play a bigger role in developing the region. So let's hope that we can work with America to create greater opportunities for not only South Africa but also the rest of Africa.
Thank you very much for those last words. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching this episode of Beyond Africa podcast with myself, Ngalim Bernard, and our guest, Jaco Kleynhans. It's been very instructive, very insightful, and we encourage you to share, subscribe, and comment in the comments section. Let's know what you think, and see you in the next episode. Jaco, don't go away.
Okay.
Yeah.